I'd like to welcome everybody back to day 2 of the Design, Implementation, Monitoring, and Sharing of Performance Standards Roundtable. This is part of the ILAR Roundtable series. And today is day 2. We're going to be putting people to work, so I hope everybody is refreshed and ready to go this morning. So the plan for this morning is we're going to first have a discussion of sort of actual development of a performance standard from in a particular institution. Then we're going to have an introduction to the breakout sessions, and then we're going to have breakout sessions where everybody has been assigned, depending on their dot color, and this will be discussed a little bit later, into different sections to look at aspects of developing a performance standard for post-approval monitoring. So we'll get on to that after our introductory speaker. And our first speaker this morning is Dr. Guy Mulder. Guy is the Executive Director of Veterinary and Professional Services at Charles River Laboratories. And he's going to be talking about a specific example for development of a performance standard.
Well, thank you. Well, and I have to admit, yesterday when I was watching the excellent presentations, I was also ticking off in my head, well, I was going to say that, and I was going to say that, and I was going to say that. So there will be some redundancy on today's talk, especially towards the beginning of it. And then I'm going to move on to an example of a performance standard approach, or a performance approach that we took with cage density within Charles River. And kind of walk through our rationalization and process as we geared up for planned and then actually performed the study looking at cage density. So today's talk, I'm going to start real briefly with reviewing performance standards. What's the guide say? We heard an awful lot about that yesterday. What I think a general approach is, and the guide reinforces this, and then the goals of a performance standard. Then I'll move into what we consider, and when I say we, it's the approach we've developed at Charles River, on what we think the key steps are, the key stakeholders that should participate in that process, and then kind of our philosophy and an example with our approach with a particular case example. And we've developed a very standardized process. We treat it much like we treat an animal care and use protocol, with a proposal process and a dedicated form that helps us walk through the steps, keeps us consistent, and also provides value down the road as we look back at it, reevaluate it periodically. And for someone, we started performance approach evaluations in about 1997 at Charles River with various aspects of the care program. And it's been nice for me that joined the organization about 10 years ago to go back into our files, and by using a standardized approach, it's very easy to look at the history of a particular performance evaluation and the data sets that help back up our decisions 10, 15 years ago. And as we add to those data sets over time, we can see the maturity and the progression of the process. So certainly the guide endorses, and we heard this yesterday, a performance-based approach to meeting the recommendations. And it should require professional input, sound judgment, and I think those often go together as professional judgment, a team approach, clearly defined outcomes and goals, and then regular monitoring of performance measures after establishment of a performance approach, although it doesn't precisely prescribe what is that regular monitoring and how should that be performed. And I'll talk a little bit about the program that we developed. And then certainly throughout all of this, there's oversight, review, involvement, and approval by the IACUC. Changes to the animal care and use programs certainly fall under the jurisdiction of the institution's IACUC, and they need to be a player throughout this entire process. So the goal that we've developed for what we would call alternative methods or performance-oriented approaches outlined in the guide is that if we alter off recommendations of the guide, the alternative, or what we call the variance, should be equivalent or provide improved conditions for the animals. There was a question yesterday, I think from one of the online participants, of if we do an evaluation and it doesn't show improvement, but it doesn't show harm, is that okay? I would suggest that if we show equivalency, we're doing just fine. If we show improvement, even better. But certainly I think the goal is the guide outlines a minimal recommendation or approach to an issue. And if we can match that approach, I think that's a valid stance for an alternative to a recommendation of the guide. And conditions that do not meet the minimal guide recommendations should result in some kind of deleterious changes to animal welfare that are measurable. And I think that's where a lot of the questions and not necessarily confusion, but challenges come up is what are those appropriate measurable parameters that are going to help us evaluate the alternative to the guide. So I think yesterday outlined, I think John outlined it very well, a three-step process for evaluating performance standards. I couldn't boil it down to 3. I got it down to 6 here. And this is from the perspective of where we really reevaluated most of our program was when the new guide came out in 2011. We sat down with it, like I think many institutions, and we essentially did a gap analysis. We identified the exceptions to the new recommendations in the guide, and I'll show you the large one that really gave us angst when it first came out. And then I think you have to then ask the question, can you simply comply with the new guide recommendations? If you can comply, I think that's the preferred route is to look at your own practices. There are many things I think many of us do in our institutions that are just historical. We've done them for 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years. The guide suggests we do it otherwise. And I think we need to take a moment and evaluate why are we doing it differently? Is it time to change our practices? We shouldn't be doing the same thing over 30 years unless truly technology, expectations, performance standards haven't changed, and we still think it's the best practice. So we need to also take a moment. Just because if we're different from the guide doesn't mean we should continue to be different from the guide. We do need to do that internal reflection of should we simply move closer to the guide recommendation or simply adopt the guide recommendation. And if the answer is no, for various reasons, that could be scientific, operational, welfare-oriented, et cetera, then we're now dealt with or challenged with a performance standard approach to address that requirement or that recommendation of the guide. And then we need to define those desired outcomes or goals, identify the performance measures, obviously, that will help us evaluate the alternative. And this requires a review of the current literature, certainly best either industry common practices or best practices, talking with peers in your organization and in other organizations, and trying to identify worthwhile performance measures. We then need to design, plan, and then perform an evaluation. And it's important here, I talked to an awful lot of people in our industry throughout the year. We host an awful lot of audits or visits or inspections, whatever you want to call them, to our facilities, and we commonly discuss some of our applications and our processes that don't directly match recommendations in the guide. And often these visitors will then reflect on their practices and how they've done their own internal reviews or perhaps no review at all. And I'm often surprised that internal operations that may not meet guide requirements, when I talk with others in the industry, they haven't necessarily compared them one-to-one with the guide recommendation. And I think if we're going to suggest that we have an alternative to a guide recommendation, we need to have compared it directly or head-to-head with the guide recommendation. And that's not always done. So I think that needs to be part of your evaluation and part of your research process. Certainly the IACUC needs to be involved in the review and the approval. In our case, they were involved in the actual planning of some of these assessments. The results need to be reviewed, and ultimately the IACUC needs to weigh in with, do they agree with these results? Do they disagree? They may disapprove. Do they require modifications or perhaps more research to help answer the question? And then moving forward, some kind of regular monitoring program. Again, it's not precisely described in the guide, and I'll show you our approach. We treat it much like we treat any other animal care and use protocol. So the key stakeholders, I think we heard about just about all of these yesterday. Certainly the IACUC is involved in this process. We involve them from the very beginning. They should certainly be involved at the point of reviewing a study protocol and reviewing the final, what we call a variance or exception. The attending veterinarian or other veterinarians in the program. Researchers, certainly the animal users, they're going to be impacted by almost every aspect of the animal care and use program. And depending on the parameter you're going to evaluate, you may need to bring in specialist researchers with unique expertise in areas of study design. In our case, we relied a great deal on behavioral assessment with the example I'll show you in a moment. So we brought in an animal behavioralist and actually a researcher with a strong track record in rodent behavior to help us. But you may need specialized equipment that needs to be brought in with someone with a different expertise base than you may have in your own group. Certainly interpretation of the results may require an outside specialist as well. And then certainly vivarium management, and this includes down to the level of the people that are caring for the cage. They often have a innate knowledge and a unique insight that as the veterinarian I may not have, where they're doing the process every day, and they may have very worthwhile ideas on how to improve a process if we're looking at developing a new alternative. So we've codified all this into a standardized approach. We think it's extremely beneficial. It keeps us on track. It creates a record through time that we can go back to and refer to. It's actually much like I think most institutions will have a formalized IACUC review process, a proposal form. We have a dedicated form for what we term variances to the guide or variances to the regulations. It provides transparency for both the committee and all involved in the process. I find the historical record is very important. I can go back to data from 1997, for example, and review our initial foray into a performance evaluation, and then we add to it each year or several years. As technology changes, the literature-based changes, our knowledge of the parameter under study changes. And that all lives much like any other research protocol in our IACUC office. So here's the process we follow. And again, it's on a standardized form. We describe, excuse me, we describe the specific procedure or practice for the exception, the species affected. We highlight and either summarize or verbatim repeat the guide recommendations on that subject. And if there's regulatory guidance also on that subject, we'll include that. We outline the proposed exception, or in our case, we call it a variance. And then most importantly, the rationale for that exception. For our cage density guideline exception that I'll talk about in a moment, the active file for that, the variance, is about 18 pages long. It's a very verbose document that both summarizes literature, our past efforts, and our recent efforts. We then propose the methods to investigate the exception. So essentially, this is a research proposal, ideally with a hypothesis, and including statistical analysis when it's applicable. The results are also summarized in this form, and then ultimately this form goes to the IACUC for review and approval, modification, et cetera. The final segment of this form is then the post-approval monitoring program that the IACUC approves and rolls forward as this variance follows forward. So this is an example of some of our variances or exceptions to the guide that we've used in a performance approach to validate. Cage density of mice and rats, I'll discuss that a little more in a moment. Cage changing frequency. Yesterday, it was nice to hear discussion on cage changing frequency, that 2 weeks is for the most part standard now with ventilated caging. I wish I'd known that before we started a validation study to assure ourselves that a 2-week change cycle is also appropriate. But we have cage changing frequency that varies by density of the cage and housing or caging or rack style, so ventilated versus static, et cetera. We have a variance for multiple rodent species in the same housing room, generally mice and rats sharing the same housing room. Separate cages, obviously, but same tertiary space. And a water bottle sanitation frequency. And we developed evaluation criteria for each of these that were unique to the question that we were asking. If we clean a bottle every 7 days or allow it to go to 14 days, is there really a difference in water quality? And how would we assess that? So that's a general approach we've taken to all of these questions. So now the example. So when the 2011 guide came out, one of the larger concerns in the new guide was this new category for a female plus litter. Didn't exist in the 1996 or 97 guide. The earlier version certainly was well highlighted here in the new one, and you see it circled in the table. And the concern was if we took a literal application of this, of one female plus litter plus a breed male in a cage, our standard cage may not always allow the space allocation described in the chart. And when you add in a second female, for many of our mouse strains, we will breed one male to two females, and they'll be there as a continual group. We can remove females or the males. We can alter that group size, but our standard breeding for many inbred strains is one male and two females, often called a trio. And strict interpretation or application of this table would have suggested this format, this breeding scheme was no longer appropriate in the size cages we had. And to transition away from that breeding scheme would have meant adding a significant number of new cages to our program, building a new space, simply to achieve the same production, the same output that we were achieving prior to the release of the new guide. And I think equally importantly, it challenged us to ask, is there really data showing that our existing and current at the time breeding densities were really detrimental to the animal, which is what we should all be asking. Animal welfare should be in the middle of all this as the target, and are there different ways to approach it? So that was the issue, cage density of breeders and mice and rats. We weren't worried about hamsters, gerbils, rabbits, etc., strictly mice and rats. So we get very specific as far as where is this application applied? Where's the variance applied? So in our case, it was applied to production facilities housing mice and rats. And importantly, we specifically stated it does not apply to animals that are experimentally manipulated. We do both of these operations in some of our facilities. We have large breeding colonies, and we may have areas adjacent or also within the organization that are truly doing research, and we treat those two groups differently. We never intended to propose that animals involved in typical research uses would be housed at a density different than recommended in the guide, simply the production animals. And this just shows you a picture of one of our production rooms. These are our standard mouse breed cages, and you can see it's not a traditional research setting. It's geared and oriented really towards efficient production of these animals. So what's the guide recommendation say? Well, the space allocation table is pretty straightforward. I showed that to you earlier. But there's also verbiage in the guide that allows for adjustment to space allocation guidelines based on performance indices. And the guide provides an example of space allocation performance indices that should be considered if you're going to consider alternative space allocation guidelines or densities. And so the guide suggests we should look at parameters such as health of the animals, reproduction of the animals, growth of the animals, behavior of the animals, activity, the space utilization, how much of that cage do they utilize routinely, and how do they utilize it, and then special needs. And they provide this example of obesity, and I would suggest this is special models. If you have obesity models that may need more space, maybe a diabetic model that urinates more excessively than standard mice and rats, they may need a different caging arrangement than your more standard stocks and strains. And then certainly experimental use. So it certainly opens the door and provides some guidance on a performance approach for an issue that can be quite challenging to otherwise consider how to approach. So the next step in our process is let's propose the variance. What are we asking for? So we're asking the IACUC to consider that we continue to use the cage density standards developed by Charles River over many years based on an experience of producing mice and rats at these densities. And it's worth mentioning, we haven't had the same cage density, the same animal density in a breed cage for 40 or 50 years. It's been modified over the years as the knowledge base has changed, as the IACUC has become more involved in the 80s to 90s, as the guide changed and identified issues like performance approach on dealing with these sorts of issues. So we've certainly modified densities over the years. And it hasn't been static, and I see going into the future, it's not going to be a static issue. As publications come out that are germane to what we're doing, we certainly have to look at those periodically, reflect them into our system, and decide, do they challenge us or suggest to us that we need to reevaluate our own internal performance. And then rationale for the variance. We're very explicit. This is a paraphrasing, but we're very explicit in our documentation as to why we think this variance is necessary or required. And so we walk through some of the points I just covered, that the guide acknowledges that space allocation recommendations are based on professional judgment and experience. We view production or commercial breeding and sale as different from the research of enrollment of these animals in research or the research use of animals. We're not experimentally manipulating these animals, and I think that makes a difference, a material difference to how we can approach their housing. The most recent version of the guide, I think, does a nice job of illustrating the irregularities or difficulty in trying to review the peer-reviewed literature that was present in 2011 and applying it to certainly a commercial production setting, but also I think an experimental research setting. There's a lack of a consistent peer-reviewed literature base to help us make this decision. There's individual studies using different study designs, different outcome measures, and it's very difficult to take that body of work, which is a small body to begin with, and apply it in a general way to be useful, I think, certainly in our production setting, and I think often it's even confusing and not terribly useful to apply in a research setting. And then we have internal data dating back to at least 1997 that's been formalized, showing that at our internal housing density guidelines, we can't identify that we've compromised animal welfare in any way. So this as the kind of general background suggests to us that it's a worthwhile endeavor to propose that we continue with our existing densities. And the next step that I'll show you is, given the new recommendation of the guide, it also the next important step was to repeat some of these studies and specifically look at more indices than we had looked at in the past. Also, the guide provides a minimal definition of adequate space, which is listed here, was discussed in the past couple of talks, and that is animals need the room to express natural postures and postural adjustments without touching the walls of their enclosure. So able to turn around, able to access food and water, rest away from soiled areas. Our current housing system allowed for that. There's also a subnote under that table that says sufficient space for mothers and litters should be available to allow the pups to develop to weaning without detrimental effects to both the mother and the litter. So one of our outcome measures had to somehow address this particular issue as well. How can we assess pup development, pup maturation, as well as the health of the mother to help validate, if we're looking at an alternative housing density, that we're not compromising the pups? We probably spent 2 or 3 months, we being a group of about 6 of us at the time, veterinarians and others, debating what are the performance measures that we should be evaluating. We ultimately came down to a definition that performance measures should be obviously objective, somehow clinically relevant, and quantifiable. So we have something that we can measure and compare. It should span a gamut of categories or animal health indicators, and that in our setting, certainly production indices are important. That's one of our missions, and it's also an indicator of colony health and individual animal health. So production indices, behavioral indices, which is outlined in the guide and certainly we believe strongly in, and that historically we hadn't done much of. And the published literature is not terribly clear as far as behavioral indices that could be impacted by increasing the density in cages. And then clinical measures, measures of morbidity and mortality. We feel strongly that this data needs to be collected in the standard housing, or in our case, production setting, where the animals are during this entire process. So in our case, that's the production barrier room or isolators. If we pull these animals out of the traditional milieu where all this would normally occur and do it in a altered experimental room, we may be adding confounders into the evaluation that wouldn't mimic how this same setting would behave or occur in a production room. So wherever possible, we did measurements in the production room. Now, some of our production rooms can have 5 or even 10,000 cages in them in one room with a dedicated staff of 10 to 15 people, let's say. It's a very different setting than pulling these into a solitary study room with one rack of animals, one caretaker. So we think it was important to do some of these studies where the animals would live their natural life. And then, of course, as we develop some of these outcome measures, we need to be thinking ahead of post-approval monitoring and what key performance indicators that we can collect in that setting where the animals will be into the future that will help us confirm in the future that continuation of this variance or exception to the guide is continuing to be non-harmful to the animals. There's some practical considerations when you're developing your sampling methodology. We didn't want to be overly reliant on extensive instrumentation or practices that may induce confounding variables or limit the sample size. For example, telemetry of heart and respiratory rate could be a surrogate measure of stress, but to instrument enough animals and to do that in a barrier setting without compromising biosecurity and other things that we have to worry about at the same time really isn't tenable in our system. Serum and urine constituents such as glucocorticoid measurements, difficult in a barrier setting without going to specialized caging, which is then imposing a confounding variable, we think, on the study. Complex behavioral assessments. We can do behavioral assessments, and I'll show you some in a barrier room, but things like videography, we can't really bring extensive videography equipment into a functioning barrier room that's also operating commercially and not dramatically impact just the function of the room. So we really had two data sets set up. One was what can be accomplished in an active room and what needed to be done in some kind of a behavioral testing setting. We can't do studies on every single stock and strain that we produce. If you've seen our catalog, it's about 1 centimeter thick, and to entertain doing studies across every animal group listed in that catalog really isn't possible. And I think the same challenge occurs at every institution, especially if you have high numbers of genetically modified animals. So you really have to decide what's a representative sample, the stock and the strains that you would evaluate in your setting that could then be generalized across the other stocks and strains in your institution. And we had to consider how many sampling locations or facilities. We have facilities across North America using very standardized purposes, standardized genetics, food, bedding, caging, environmental parameters, temperature, ventilation, et cetera, that we felt comfortable that if we can illustrate that the settings are similar enough that we don't need to do extensive evaluations in each of those settings. Again, this is where we spend a lot of our time, is really asking this question. What are likely to be the measurable adverse events that could arise from selecting the alternative, whatever that alternative is? And based on what you think those measurable adverse events are, you're going to identify performance measures and figure out ways to evaluate that performance. So with respect to cage space and a mother or a breeding group, certainly reproductive indices, growth, general health, aggression, stereotypic behaviors appear to be reasonable measures for consideration, and they're the measures that we ultimately adopted. If you were looking at cage change frequency, you might look at soiling of the bedding and how would you qualify that or quantify that. Humidity in the cage, ammonia in the cage, other gas production in the cage from waste products. Oh, you might look at growth of the animals in the cage, utilization of the space in the cage. So depending on what the question is, you then need to your answer set to that question is going to dictate and start to refine parameters that you may want to then measure going forward. So again, our performance measures fell into these categories: production indices, behavioral indices, and clinical measures. And we thought it was important to select multiple parameters or measures from each of these categories. And again, the guide recommended this list of considerations, which happen to span those categories to the left. So reproductive performance, there are a number of indices that can be utilized. This was the initial list we started with. Some of these may look very straightforward. Some of them may seem a little new to you. So production index, which is the number of pups weaned per female per breeder per week. This is essentially a measure of the productiveness of the colony in general. We use this quite commonly across our operation to evaluate one colony against another. A black 6 mouse raised in Raleigh, North Carolina, a colony should be performing very similarly, if not identically, to one in Hollister, California. So 2 different production settings, opposite sides of the country, but a production index is one key performance indicator or KPI that can help us evaluate, are they behaving relatively equivalently? If they're not, then it's it's a challenge to us to then go in and investigate why the difference. Litter size at birth, surviving to weaning, sex ratio, male to females per litter, or weaning survival males and females, weaning weight, interlitter interval, time to first plug. These start to address things like maturity of the animal, sexual maturity. That could be affected by density and other environmental parameters. Time to female pup's vaginal opening. Again, indicators of pup development, and there's published literature addressing each of these for the stocks and strains that we commonly use. For behavioral assessments, we were primarily worried about, I guess, two things. One is space utilization within the cage, and I'll show you in a moment how we assess that. The other is aggression or fighting. So maternal aggression towards pups, part of that will be reflected in the production indices, how many pups survive to weaning, but we can also assess that directly by observing how the moms interact with the pups. And then certainly aggression between weanlings and adults that are housed at these higher densities. Hair loss and barbering, stereotypic behavior, and space utilization within the cage. So we developed scoring systems. Most of these parameters could be measured right in the barrier room by standard husbandry technicians that received some additional training from our behavioral staff. So we had developed scoring systems that could be collected at cage size. And for space utilization, we really couldn't do that meaningfully in a production barrier room, and I'll show you in a moment where we had to develop a special setting for that. So this is just an example of behavioral assessment scoring for fighting and aggression on the top and barbering. And it was graded, so we had training that provided to the staff so we could have a consistent grading scale when these staff did their daily or weekly routines with the animals. And that data was collected and then collated and sent to our behavioral staff that would then evaluate it. So we have wounding, we have none down to severe wounds that require either treatment or euthanasia. So there's the sort of things you're probably familiar with in a mouse colony or rat colony. And then barbering, again, mild, moderate, severe, a fairly simple scheme that we could devise training for through pictures and schematics so that we had a standardized approach no matter who the staff member was. Stereotypic behaviors at the time of cage change or throughout the week as they were working with the animals, working with the cages, they were trained to evaluate these four parameters: bar chewing, jumping, pacing or the circling, that sort of thing in the cage, and then circle or flip. You've seen the mice that will kind of do continual somersaults in the cage. So very classic stereotypic behaviors, and that we think, in theory, could be affected by density of the animals. So finally, space utilization. Again, we couldn't do this in the behavior room or in the production room, and you can see why with the instrumentation here. So we brought animals into a behavioral suite, essentially a quiet room. We had a bank of cameras that could simultaneously record, I think it was 30 or 36 cages, and we set these up with breeding animals and did 24/7 observations of them for, I think, 3 litter cycles. So not the entire breeding life of an animal, but multiple litters. And then we had assessment periods during that time where we evaluated activity within the cage, space utilization within the cage, et cetera. Then finally, clinical measures. So morbidity and mortality. Certainly if you had injured animals or animals that died, we can quantitate that by sex. The breeding colony segment, was it the nucleus part of the colony, the production part of the colony, the expansion part of the colony? Because conditions, density and conditions in those parts of the colony can be different. Animals euthanized for cause. Body condition scoring can be utilized certainly, and there's nice publications outlining how to do that in a standardized way. And then a very common assessment that we do periodically on all of our stocks and strains is growth curve comparisons. So we take animals and we weigh them from the time of weaning at about 3 weeks of age up through 10 weeks of age, large groups that are statistically designed to show, to allow comparison between breeding areas such as breeding facilities. We spent a great deal of time trying to decide what stocks and strains or genotypes should we evaluate. We can't evaluate all possible stocks and strains. It's just not practical. It's not affordable. So we concentrated on common lines. For example, here, the C57 Black 6, the most common inbred mouse used in research and a common background strain for many genetically engineered models. The CD1, the most common outbred. Another common name would be a Swiss mouse. And then for the rats, the CD rat or the Sprague Dolly rat and the brown Norway, again, an outbred and an inbred. And these reflected the majority of the mice and rats that we produce, certainly, as well as those being utilized in research. Our research proposal was pulled together and formulated with a team approach. Again, there were veterinarians on our team. We brought in a behavioral scientist with significant rodent experience. We had members of the IACUC, we had production management, and we had husbandry staff. Everyone on this list was going to be involved in the study, and they certainly had opportunity to plan and develop the study. And then ultimately, of course, this study proposal went to the IACUC for review and approval before we initiated it. As we started collecting data, we also started discussing what do we do if we identify differences. If you collect enough data points, enough different parameters, you will find differences. Whether or not they're physiologically or metabolically or behaviorally relevant is a question you're going to have to grapple with, as we did. So just because we find a statistical difference in a value, so p-value, let's say, of less than 0.05, may not mean there's a problem. It may just reflect that there's a difference, there's adaptation going on. And adaptation can certainly occur without harm or risk to animal welfare. And I think we had a nice example yesterday with housing room temperature. We house rodents at temperatures about what's in this room, maybe 70 degrees or so, 68, 70, 72. Their thermal neutral zone is much higher than that. So we commonly house them in an area where they would be thermal stressed, cold stressed. And to combat that, we typically do a couple of things. We often house them socially so they can huddle together. We usually provide them contact bedding that they can burrow into, and we provide nesting material. So by providing them the ability and the resource to modify their local environment, they adapt to this relatively cold stress just fine. So a measurable difference doesn't necessarily translate into harm or decreased welfare. It really takes, it's that continual stress when they can't adequately adapt to it is when we should become more concerned. So again, it was unlikely that all findings were going to be in agreement between guide recommendations and the alternative. And so our IACUC was very cognizant that they're going to need to consider, is there a definable and consistent mechanism, if we see a difference, that would appear to be or clearly linked to a detrimental effect to animal welfare? And if so, we either need to change the process. Perhaps we need to do further study. Research isn't simple. We ask one simple question that leads us to another one and doesn't get us to the final answer. So it may be a multi-step process. Or we may need to put restrictions on whatever practice it is that we're considering. So here's a very brief outline of the experimental design we undertook for cage space density evaluation. Again, this is in breeding animals. So it was a Latin square factorial design, and the parameters that were being altered was the cage type or size, the breeding condition, and the strain of animal. So we used two inbred strains, a black 6 mouse and a brown Norway rat. Those are the inbreds. And two outbred strains, a CD1 mouse and a CD rat. The breeding conditions for mice, we typically breed mice one of three ways. We can pair the male and the female together and remove the male when the female is pregnant, or for a time breeding operation, you may remove them after an overnight period. So the female is alone most of the time. As a pair matched one male to one female that are together consistently, including when the litter is present. And then a trio, one male and two females. Rats, we really only do two breeding schemes. Time mating, where you match a male and a female together for a brief period of time and then remove the male. And then pair mating, which is more common, where we pair the animals up consistently. We do harem or group breeding as well, where you have a group of females and a group of males together. And as you identify pregnant females, you remove them from the cage and replace them with another non-pregnant female. That was not part of the study design here. And then cage sizes. So our initial thought was let's compare the Charles River Standard, our internal guidance that we've developed over the years, against the 2011 guide, a fairly simple design. After review of the literature and discussion with our behavioral person, it seemed very doubtful that we were going to be able to see significant differences between those two groups. The cage sizes are not that far apart. So we decided to expand the study design to pick a very small cage, and all these are commercially available cages, so we didn't have custom cages made. But we essentially went to the smallest mouse cage available on the market, and we went to the largest mouse cage available on the market. And the theory was if there's a point where there's too little space and it starts to detrimentally affect the animal, we should be able to see that if we put them in the smallest cage we can find. And if more cage is always better, which is kind of the anecdotal assumption, I think, by many folks, if you get a really large cage, then that should be more beneficial. And if you see detrimental effects in the smallest cage, they should disappear entirely in the larger cage. So that's kind of the general framework that we took as we designed the study. So these are the cage sizes we used. 226 centimeters is roughly, I think, 35 square inches. It's a very small cage. I think it's a cage designed for housing single animals. The second cage down the list on the left here, 305 centimeters, is our standard mouse breed cage that we utilize in our operations. The next one down, 432 centimeters, is a guide compliant cage for the number of mice that we were going to put into it. And then 800 centimeters squared was the largest cage, roughly 2 times the size of the guide compliant cage. And a similar arrangement with the rats. The second one down was our standard breed cage, and then one that was as small as we could reasonably find, and then significantly larger at the top end. This just gives you an idea on what those two cages look like. So the largest cage on the right, approximately a little over 2 times the width and quite a bit deeper or longer than the smallest cage, just to give you some perspective. And again, for the rat cages, similar looking caging, but again, about a 2 to 4-fold difference in size across those cages. So for behavioral measures, in addition to what was performed in the barrier rooms, we had this behavioral suite set up where we set up animals under constant videography and then looked at parameters such as play behavior in the young, the popcorning behavior you'll see in mice where the young mice jump fairly high when you open the cage. And they also do it with one another when the cage is closed. And we looked at periods of time over a 24-hour period after litters had been delivered or born. And we used 48 mouse cages and 32 rat cages. So again, these were in this room for approximately 3 to 4 months as they went through this assessment period. So reproductive measures, we looked at litter size at birth, litter size at weaning, weaning weight, and the production index. We also looked at hair loss, fighting and wounding, and stereotypic behavior. Some of this was performed in the behavioral lab that I showed a minute ago, and then this was also collected, or the data collected in the study performed in a barrier room with relatively large numbers of cages. So what I'm going to show you is just a glimpse of the data. These results are to be published soon. The rat work has been accepted for publication, and the mouse studies have been submitted and are under consideration at the moment for publication. And the authors being Kate Corning-Pritchett and I should say Brianna Gaskell. So preliminary results. Cages can be too small. Surprisingly, reproductive performance in mice did not decrease or suffer in the smallest cage. But CD rats showed a drop in reproductive performance in the smallest cage. And this picture, and I realize there's some flashback from the camera there, that's the smallest mouse cage with a mom and litter to be weaned. And you can see there's an awful lot of mouse mass in that cage compared to the cage bottom. And I think we would all agree that's an overcrowded cage. So that was the smallest. And certainly one that we would never propose should be used for any kind of a ongoing breeding program. But we did not see significant differences between the Charles River standard cage that we've used historically and the guide compliant cage or the larger cages. So the 2 cages in the middle and the largest cage, from the performance indices we looked at, all behaved the same. We did see one change of behavior. Its significance is still under discussion, but it was something that was coined corner inactivity. This was a rodent behavior that hadn't been identified in the literature before. Brianna coined the term corner inactivity. It's only seen in adults, only seen when the pups were a specific age, roughly 2 weeks and 2 weeks of age and over. It was seen in all cage types, so all sizes, but it was more frequently seen in the smaller cages, and the smallest cage in particular was statistically significant versus the other cages. And with the smaller cage, it makes us wonder if perhaps females may benefit from vertical space that allows them to escape the older pups. And this is the behavior that makes us wonder that. So the rat is on the upper left and the mouse cage is on the lower right. And you can see the female, the mom here, up in the corner with her nose up in the corner of the cage. So we call this corner inactivity. It was only seen as the pups were older, generally 2 weeks and above. It was seen in every cage type. And if you had the anthropomorphize, it seemed to be saying, I need a break. The pups are okay. And I'm going to go over here in the corner for a while. It was seen in the largest cage. So space alone was not the primary determinant, but it was most frequently seen in the smaller cage. So the full results, more than I've shared with you guys today, were presented to our IACUC. Obviously some discussion. And the IACUC ultimately approved the continued use of our internal CRL cage densities for breeding of mice and rats. So this process from start to finish, I think, was fairly well deliberate, well planned. It was an extensive research evaluation. It took us over 6 months to collect the data and over another 6 months for someone to sit down and look at hours and hours and hours of videography of mice and rats. It was not a simple study, but I think more thorough than probably we realized when we set out to perform the study. But in our minds, we were very comfortable with continuing our current housing density. And then finally, the IACUC was challenged with, what's our post-approval monitoring program for this? So we've decided, and we've decided this years ago, and it will continue with this variance, in that we're going to do an annual review, much like we do every protocol. So if we approve a protocol today, a year from today, and 2 years from today, there's an annual review process and a dedicated form for that process. And we're going to look at some of those key performance indicators that I shared earlier to evaluate whether we think it's still reasonable to continue with this exception to the guide. And then every 3 years, a de novo review where there'll be a complete literature review, and again, much like starting from scratch. We don't envision repeating this level of study. I don't think that's necessary. If we were to change caging size, style, housing arrangement, et cetera, then I think we'd have to open up for consideration whether it's necessary to then do further studies. Now, we also have a regular ongoing review that's outside of direct IACUC involvement, and that's production management reviews production indices routinely, weekly to monthly, depending on the colony, and that involves both management and folks like myself, that if we start to see differences or drift in those indices, then those get direct attention outside of the IACUC, and if we think it's a welfare issue or there's something else going on, often that's communicated back to the IACUC. But there is another level of ongoing daily to monthly to weekly, however you want to qualify it, review of the colony performance as well. But it's so a formal review process of at least once annually, and then this ongoing review that's kind of continual. And I'd be happy to take some questions. I know I ran kind of fast. A lot of this was discussed yesterday, so I did speed through the early part of the presentation. Thanks.
Diane Gartner, University of Pennsylvania. I just had a couple questions. It wasn't clear to me, are you using open, static, or ventilated cages?
So for this, open cages, which is our standard production setting in barrier rooms.
That was what I was suspecting. So were you monitoring room ammonia or room parameters?
Not as part of the barrier room part of the process, no.
Thank you.
Yeah. I should say, though, we do monitor room ammonia on a quarterly basis in all of our barrier rooms, but not as part of this study.
Norman Peterson, MedImmune. So we heard yesterday from Brad Goodwin that we have to perform these studies in our individual institutions for good reason. We've also heard that the guide is a living document. So kind of a rhetorical question. So you've done these studies, somebody else does some other studies and publishes on it. What is sort of the critical threshold to kind of change sort of the standard of practice so that not everybody has to perform these individual studies? And the other point too, I think just the way that I phrased my question, what we have to be careful of too, it's sort of biasing that, yeah, we do want to change these standards. So we got to be careful too when we run these studies that we don't bias it to a certain type of outcome. So I'll leave it open.
I think that's a great question, and actually I don't know if I don't entirely agree with the answer we heard yesterday that you need site-specific evaluations, which implies every institution. And at some institutions, if you have multiple facilities within your institution, which many academic campuses do, and certainly we do, that you would then need to perform some level of evaluation in every one of those institutions or every one of those facilities. I don't think that's reasonable. The guide doesn't differentiate between setting. It simply says so many mice or so much based on body weight in a cage, and it generalizes across the entire population of animals or mice in our facilities. There should be a way that if we have publications that show generally consistent findings in several different settings, so that could be academic settings, commercial breeder settings, or other, at some point as the best practice, or at least an accepted practice, should be able to look at that literature and say standard caging, static or ventilated, these different densities have all been evaluated. We were unable to identify harm in any of these settings. That should be generalizable. I don't think Norm, your institution, needs to go out and validate it, and then Pennsylvania down the street needs to validate it, and University of California needs to validate it. I don't think that's necessary. I don't know if we're there quite yet. When you look at the literature now, looking at something as complex as cage density, the literature is not all that clear. I think we should do some of these studies. Perhaps there should be a more common approach to evaluating questions like housing density so the results of those studies are more comparable. But at some point, we need to be able to say, this seems reasonable. And groups like ALAC, I think, should be ready to agree that individual studies don't need to be performed at every single institution out there. So it's my personal opinion.
Hi, Paul Locke from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I wanted to ask you if you could just elaborate on one point that you mentioned, and that is that you've got a lot of different types of animals in your production facility, but you had to choose certain animals to do your research as representative. And if you could talk a little bit more about how you decided which of those quote-unquote representative animals you chose. And also, I think, since we're on the topic of generalizability, when you publish your research, if another facility were interested in kind of going through the same process, how might they think about generalizability?
So the first question is easy. We selected representative stocks and strains based on the most commonly produced and the most commonly used in research. And we wanted to then also select an inbred and an outbred of both mice and rats. So the black 6 mouse is probably the most common mouse used in research. The CD1 or Swiss Webster or outbred white mouse is probably numbered, well, total numbers may even be higher, but certainly a very common mouse. Certainly the most common rat used in research, and that's everything from academic research to safety and toxicology research, is the Sprague Dolly or CD rat. There aren't that many inbred rats bred commercially, and we selected the brown Norway because it's probably one of the more common. I think if you're an institution looking internally to look at a study, I think what's your most common model? What's the most frequently, what's the animal that's most commonly placed into the setting that's alternative to what's recommended in the guide? I don't think we could look at 100 and some stocks and strains, and I think campuses that have 1,000 different transgenics or genetically engineered models can't begin to even entertain looking at a dozen, 100 or more genetically engineered models. So I think we have to pick representative stocks and strains and then generalize out from there. The second question was, it was about generalization, but I don't remember the specifics.
Yeah, thanks. Just how would an institution that, let's say, looks at your research and wanted to go through a similar process generalize or think about the information that you present in your publications to help them go through that sort of experimental process?
So just speaking off the cuff, I think when this is published and gone through a peer-reviewed process and the data is available, I think if you're considering something similar, you could look at what were our performance measures and do you agree with them? Do they make sense in your setting? They may not, but they may. And what were our findings? And if your research group and your IACUC feels those are reasonable measures for your setting, then I think it'd be appropriate to take a similar sort of approach. We used open or open top cages in a large production setting. There aren't too many people that do that in large scale other than commercial breeders. So I would think one of the variables that may make it difficult to generalize this study directly to many institutions is the use of ventilated caging. And does that change the dynamic of how the animals behave or respond in that setting? So I would envision there will be studies looking at ventilated housing and similar outcome measures, and those are probably more generalizable across other ventilated caging systems. But I think as far as our basic housing system, if you're using open top cages in a breeding setting, there may be some comparability between our data and what you would see internally to your own operation. But I don't know if there's an easy answer to that, because I think an IACUC and the researchers on that IACUC are going to be unique, and they're going to have their own input and opinion about study design.
David Kurtz, NIHS, and I'll start with a comment and then finish with a question. So to address kind of the discussion that Norm brought up and we alluded to yesterday about, do we need to create the data at our own institution? I think that's hopefully one of the goals of this workshop and moving forward, is that we start to generate the data, put it out there for people to see. And that's, I'm very grateful that you guys are publishing this. This is how people disseminate the data. That eventually we all will get to a point where we agree that, all right, this standard seems to work in multiple different settings. Okay, you don't have to repeat the full study. You need to collect some data on your own. And I think it gets to what a couple of speakers alluded to yesterday. There's got to be this balance between performance and engineering standards. And the engineering standards may not always be correct. And until, say, a revision to the guide, revision to the animal welfare regulations, we can use the data generated from these performance standards to eventually maybe adjust the engineering standards to more appropriate, realistic ones. So that's our hope, is that we maintain that balance using the data that's being generated. So my question one other comment on what Norm brought up. Obviously with open top cages, there's going to be an obvious difference in the microenvironment with static cages in individually ventilated cages. So obviously there's going to be some data that has to be generated in these other settings. You couldn't take that and go, well, I can do that in my IBCs, or I can do that in my static cages, because your ammonia levels and CO2 levels will be much greater. All right, so my question is, obviously in your production side, you had to focus on the strains that you picked. It would be too big of a project to focus on others. I'm going to assume in your your monitoring, post-approval monitoring, that those indices are carried across all the different strains. And are you starting to identify strains that may not fit into those standards that you developed?
Routine non-disease models, no, we haven't identified issues. Diabetic models and obese models certainly require a different approach to housing and density and cleaning frequency, et cetera. But for our standard stocks and strains, we haven't seen a difference that we've identified. Looks like Dave has a question.
Thanks, Guy. As yesterday, these are a couple questions that came from our participants online. The first is, as this discussion has gone on and many statements are made concerning the lack of definitive research, is it possible that the presence of engineering standards has inhibited the development of performance standards?
I would say yes. I think if you open up the guide and there's an engineering standard on a look at the cage density chart. If you read the top of the chart, it says recommended space allocation. It doesn't say required, minimal, et cetera. But I don't think there's a comfort level by many institutions to look at some of that data and say, this doesn't work for us for whatever reason, or we think we have a equally good or perhaps a better way to do something. The easiest route is the engineering approach. If we need, air changes per hour in a room is a simple one. 10 to 15 doesn't raise an eyebrow. If you want to dial it down to 8 or 9 air changes per hour, now you need data to show that you're not harming air quality, harming the animals, or the work environment for the people. It's simply easier to adjust your room up to 10 to 15 air changes per hour. So yes, I think it stops, it's not a significant roadblock, but it certainly is a roadblock to considering moving outside of that guidance and developing a justification and rationale for it.
Okay. The second one, just to paraphrase, I liked your presentation very much. Let's see, but there was a question, I think you touched on a piece of this, but could you share how much time and resources were required to develop this project and bring it to completion?
Yeah, I don't have a specific number. It was a lot. We essentially had a PhD behavioralist, Brianna Gaskell, who was brought on staff as for several reasons, but one primary one was to help design, perform, and evaluate some of the data you just saw. So it certainly was resource heavy. Now, an academic institution where you have in-house talent that may have some of these credentials and expertise may not require bringing staff on board, but it certainly, there's some degree of resource with every study that I think any of us perform. This was very resource heavy. We had specialized equipment to purchase. We had staffing to bring on board that didn't exist in the organization prior to starting this initiative. So yes, it can be very resource heavy. This took us over a year to collect the data and evaluate the data, and it's probably been another 6 months working on the publications to get it out in the peer-reviewed literature. So it's not an easy process. And I think that's something else we need to be cognizant of. Many institutions don't have the internal resources to do extensive studies, certainly at the level of what I just described. But I think as there's a literature base to point to, I would hope that less involved studies could be performed to show similar responses with perhaps a smaller data set to align with published studies and help justify internal practices without doing such extensive research.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.